Over the past couple of days, we have taken a look at some different research methods that psychologists use to try and establish understandings of the individual's behavior and what may potentially be leading to some of those behaviors. But as we've seen with those research methods, there are some major limitations to those in the fact that we can't really establish a causal relationship saying that if this happens, then this happens. The only way that we can truly do that in psychological research is through the use of experimentation. So our goal today is to really look at experimentation and how to just establish a basic understanding of what experimentation is. So as you can see on your screen, experimentation, by its definition, is a research method in which we are going to manipulate one factor or one variable in a specific situation to find out what effect that has on a specific behavior or a specific result that we are trying to research. So when we're looking at this, just as in some other research methods, we do want to create a hypothesis. And for today's sake, I'm just going to use the hypothesis looking at two variables here in sugar consumption and the impact that that might have on an individual with ADHD. So my hypothesis here is if sugar consumption increases, then a child with ADHD will show increased impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. So our goal with experimentation, if that is our hypothesis, is to manipulate the variable of sugar. I want to know that if we increase or decrease levels of sugar, what impact is that ultimately going to have on the child? Are they going to be more hyper or less impulsive or less inattentive, so forth. So as we look at this and comparing experimentation to other research methods, again, there are some benefits to using experimentation, but there are some drawbacks to experimentation as well. As you can see on your screen, benefits here, this does allow us to establish cause and effect relationship. It is the only research method that psychologists have that allow them to actually establish cause and effect relationships, and it allows us to control various variables. But a limitation, if we look at experimentation, is that sometimes conducting an experiment is not feasible due to ethical guidelines. And we'll talk further about what those ethical guidelines will be. But for example, I can't conduct an experiment on somebody if I know that this is going to put them in physical or psychological harm. In addition, because experimentations do occur in a laboratory environment, sometimes what happens in the artificial laboratory environment where everything is so controlled, the results don't always generalize to the larger population. And that is that becomes a problem because ultimately we want to know with experimentation, can we apply these findings to the real world? So with experimentation, again, we are looking at variables. We want to control variables as much as possible, and ultimately we are trying to manipulate one variable. This should sound pretty familiar from your science classes, but we do have independent and dependent variables. So going back to my hypothesis and looking at sugar consumption and individuals with ADHD, the independent variable, that is the one that I am going to purposefully manipulate, or the one that I am going to purposefully change between some different groups to see what the impact will be. And then the independent variable, once we manipulate that, we're going to see what impact does that have then on the dependent variable. The dependent one is the one that's going to be affected by the manipulation. So going back to our original hypothesis, if sugar consumption increases, then a child with ADHD will show increased impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. Our independent variable is going to be sugar consumption. Are we going to increase above the normal amount? Are we going to decrease below the normal amount? Are we just going to eliminate it completely? And then our dependent variable, we're going to measure impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. We want to see what impact does that have. Now, when we are conducting an experiment, one of the things we have to do is to try and control for confounding variables. These are other factors that when we're designing our experiment, we want to take into consideration that could potentially have an effect on the dependent variable. In psychological research, there are some very, very common confounding variables. These are things such as age of an individual, the gender of an individual, the culture in which the individual was raised, as well as the socioeconomic status, that an individual has in society. Are they very poor? Are they rich? That could have a huge impact in terms of access to resources and education that other individuals may not have. So, for example, if a cognitive researcher is wanting to test the abilities of memory, or if another researcher is trying to study intelligence, those can be some things that they would want to take into consideration. Okay, so as you can see here, in our case, with confounding variables, if we're setting up an experiment, do we allow hyperactive children to choose which sugar group they're going to be in? If we did, then that poses a problem to our overall research design. When we are also designing our experiment, one of the things that we have to do, because ultimately with the scientific method we want this to be able to be replicated. We want to know, can another researcher complete this experiment, and will they get similar results? So as such, we want to make sure that we operationalize as much as possible. And as you can see on your screen, operational definitions are what psychologists and other researchers will use, but those are a statement of procedures or a specific set of ways that a researcher is going to use to measure a specific behavior or quality. Okay, so if you look to the right of your screen, when we look at ADHD symptoms, going back to our original example, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention, again, I'm going to define impulsivity as the number of times per hour that a child calls out without raising his or her hand in a classroom setting, okay, or specifically in this experiment. Hyperactivity I may define as the number of times per hour that a child is out of his or her seat, and inattention might be the total number of minutes that a child is continuously being on task before they become distracted. Now, when we look at all of this, when we look at the variables, when we look at operationalizing these definitions, ultimately once we have that set, when we have our foundation set for our experiment, we now need to start putting people into our two groups, our control group and our experimental group. Okay? The experimental group, that is the group that we are going to purposefully manipulate these one variable, okay, our independent variable. So in this case, with sugar consumption in our experimental group, we're going to put children who have ADHD, and we're going to increase the level of sugar consumption that child has. And then we want to see what impact is that going to have on their behaviors, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. Now, to ensure, though, that we have something to compare back against, we have to have a control group. That group is going to be the group where nothing is changed. Absolutely nothing has to change. So, for example, in our ADHD group, our control group is going to be just ADHD children. We're not going to purposefully increase the levels of sugar that they are going to consume because we need to know if we have normal levels of sugar consumption in those children. We need to be able to compare, what happens when we actually increase the level of sugar consumption. Now, with our experimental and control group, we want to make sure that as much as possible everything remains consistent between those, that they're pretty much identical except for the one factor that we are manipulating. So one of the things that we have to take into consideration with experimentation is how can we do that? And as you can see in that bottom right, the lone way that researchers have is to use what is known as random assignment. A random assignment is a technique that researchers will use in which they randomly place individuals into either control group or experimental group. One of the most common ways, or one of the easiest ways rather, let's start there, might just be to flip a coin. So as a participant comes in, we can flip a coin. If it comes up heads, that individual might be placed in our experimental group, whereas an individual who comes in, if it comes up tails, they may be placed in our control group. That instance, we leave a lot up to chance, is the coin going to come up heads or tails? And that helps to randomize things. But what most researchers will use is they will use a random number generator. You can find random number generators online. There are various programs that have number generators built in, or you can just use calculators that also use random number generators to create that. But what the researcher will do is they'll assign each participant a number. So if we have 20 participants in this study, we'll assign each one a number 1 through 20, and we'll say that in my experimental group I need 10 participants, and in my control group I need another 10 participants, and we'll say for our experimental group I need 10 participants between numbers 1 through 20, and we'll use the random number generator, and whatever 10 numbers it spits out, those are the ones that we'll put into our experimental group. The other 10 we'll put into our control group. And this really does help to minimize the confounding variables that could potentially exist. Now, with random assignment, this is something that is specifically only done in experimentation. You never do this with surveys. In experimentation, if it is possible, because ultimately we want to generalize our results, we can sample the population, we can randomly sample, and then we can also random assign. But you don't have to do both in experimentation. Okay? With experimentation, you definitely have to randomly assign, but you don't always have to random sample. With surveys, you always have to random sample. Now, also with experimentation, one of the things that we may also want to take into consideration is what impact might a placebo have. Okay? A placebo is something that is completely inactive, as you can see on the right side of your screen. It's an inactive substance or a fake treatment in place of the experimental treatment. Okay, so for example, there's a very famous psychological experiment in which researchers were curious as to what would happen about perceived pain, and if they gave individuals a drug that would reduce pain receptors. And in one group, they did give a drug that reduced pain receptors in the brain, so therefore, when they were exposed to pain levels, they didn't experience pain as much. And in another group, they were told that they were given a substance that blocked pain receptors in the brain, when actually they just gave them a sugar pill. And it actually had no impact in terms of biologically what was happening in the brain. So these individuals, because they had a placebo, they were believing that this drug was going to block pain receptors in the brain, and as part of the study they had to repetitively hit their thumb with a hammer, and then they had to rate their pain experience. So the researchers ultimately wanted to know, did this drug that they were testing, the real pain receptor, the pain blocker, versus the placebo, ultimately what they found is that individuals that had the placebo, they actually rated their experiences of pain as being comparable with those that were receiving the drug. So sometimes we can fake ourselves out in terms of the expectations about an intervention. Okay? So that is another thing that researchers have to take into consideration if they are conducting an experiment. Do they want to know, will a placebo, will a drug, or another treatment create a similar result as an actual drug or as an actual treatment? And lastly, one other thing that researchers may use is what is known as a double-blind procedure. And as you can see there, what a double-blind procedure is neither the participants nor the research staff knows who is in the control group or who is in the experimental group. And the big reason for doing this is that research assistants may actually interact differently with individuals if they know if they're in the experimental or if they are in the control group. So therefore, again, this helps, in terms of the double blind, helps to minimize confounding variables. And then lastly, at the end, once we've conducted our experiment, once we've gathered our data, lastly, as part of our scientific method, we want to determine, was there a result that we can report back? So in determining that result for experimentation, we want to use the most common language in terms of causal language. And the most common one is the one at the very bottom. We want to create if-then statements. So if our original hypothesis was true, I could report that out as being the result of the study. And again, I would say that if sugar consumption increases, then a child with ADHD will show increased impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. That specifically would allow other researchers to know these were the direct results of the experimentation that were conducted.